Hey there, educators. Welcome back to another episode of Higher Ed Hot Takes. I'm your host, Ashley Berry, and the CEO of the Higher Ed Institute. Today's episode is going to be focused around the possibility of rolling back diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racist initiatives on college campuses nationwide. And today, joining us, we have a very special co-host. We have William Hardaway, and we just wanted to give him a few minutes to introduce himself and tell us about the work that he's doing for DEIA at his own institution.
Thank you for having me, Ashley. My name is William Hardaway. I am a designer by trade, and so I'm an instructional designer at the institution that I work for, which means that I design curriculum and courses to support faculty in the classroom. And I also design courses to develop faculty, which is how we met. Specifically, I design at this moment courses related to artificial intelligence and diversity, equity, inclusion in the classroom, or equity mindedness in the classroom. I grew up in Texas, so a very small town. My town was about 900 people, but very, very poverty stricken, very much uh, under that umbrella of like oppression when it comes to drugs and alcohol, poverty, things like that. And then when I went to university, it wasn't something that I expected to do. It was just something that I ended up doing, and so I like to say that because I think a lot of people's perspectives is that like middle, quote unquote, middle of America, everybody has these like expectations to go to college and do whatever. That was never an expectation when I was growing up. I have more family members that have done time in prison than have gone to university or college at all or any advanced education. So that's a bit about my background and upbringing, and I'm happy to have this conversation.
And thank you for your vulnerability, by the way. We appreciate you telling us a little bit about your own background. So you mentioned the fact that you and I met via a training that you were facilitating through the chancellor's office, the Cal State California Chancellor's
Mhm.
Office, correct? It was specifically a training around diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism practices that structured the classroom in a way that created inclusivity for all of our students and very specifically our students of color. And
Mhm.
so I was hoping that you could like walk the audience through a little bit of that, tell us what some of the strategies that you used were, and kind of what the purpose of the training was.
Yeah, so the purpose was it was interesting because a lot of my time in higher ed, I started out in student services, and so a lot of that was advising. I worked a lot with the Educational Opportunity Program and the Summer Bridge experience for students from historically oppressed backgrounds to come into university for the first time, like first generation students, and then coordinating a tutoring program before I got into instructional design. And so what I noticed in those spaces, and I'm talking about I was in those spaces for like 14 years before getting into instructional design. What I noticed in those spaces at the time were a couple of things that were very jarring for me. One was just because you build an institution and you build it around these principles and values of learning and opportunity and things like that, I very quickly noticed myself as a student, but also as a professional, that the backgrounds that we come from, the cultures that we come from, the experiences that we've had, um, impacts how we interact at an institution.
Mhm.
And that's for both folks that are from historically oppressed backgrounds and folks who have like that kind of hidden privilege that they haven't realized yet, or folks
Mhm.
that are from very privileged legacy backgrounds as well. And how we interact in the institution is just so critical to outcomes for the
Mhm.
institution. And so when I took this instructional design position, the director of our center asked, like, what would I be interested in developing faculty on, the first thing I thought of was like equity in the classroom,
Mm-hmm.
just because of all the students that I had heard from about like those being issues.
Mm-hmm.
From like the smallest example being, I don't know. I don't know that I can communicate with my professor, or I don't, I'm scared to ask for this, deadline extension,
Mm-hmm.
to the extreme of like my professor profiled me because I was wearing sweats and assumed that I was an athlete and said that they're not going to give me any leeway in the course. That was the first interaction we had when I met them, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
to, micro assaults and stuff like that in the classroom. And so that's what I wanted to focus on. And so in order to do that, just being a person that's steeped in like creative problem solving as a
Mm-hmm.
as a theory,
Mm-hmm.
I started with interviewing stakeholders for those interactions. So students, faculty, staff, administrators. Um, and I had to do like 20 something interviews before I came up with an outline for the class.
Mm-hmm.
Then I went back and interviewed some of those same people and some other folks about like, hey, what would you think of an experience that had these elements? And what the elements were, first of all, like, who am I and how do I connect with people around me? So identity mapping.
Mm-hmm.
The second element was systemic oppression. Like, do I have a sound understanding of what that even looks like, what that even is?
Mm-hmm.
And then the third was like data. So data can be both used and misused at an
Mm-hmm.
institution, and it can be like a tool for oppression or a tool against oppression, depending on who's wielding it and how they're using it. And then the fourth was uh, uh, interviewing for empathy, or like how do you kind of seek thicker data, because very quantitative broad data is the term is like thin data, like it has big numbers and it is summative, but it doesn't really mean much. Like you can say only 30% of our students are graduating, but you don't know what that really means until you talk to the people.
Right.
And then the fifth was prototyping for change. So how do you validate changes prior to actually making them and experimenting on folks
Right.
at mass?
Right. And that was for me anyways, when I was teaching at the Cal State, that was so helpful in being able to think about how I structured my classroom more equitably. So I want to thank you for that, because it was an amazing training. Um, but I wanted to talk about, so now that we've kind of like established the things that we're looking at in terms of equity and how this is determining student success metrics, right? Um, I think about when DEI really appeared on the scene, when it was pushed to the forefront, like because
Hmm.
it's always something that we've been talked, like ever since I was in grad school in 2014, 15, 16, we've been talking about DEIA.
Hmm.
But I want to say, like, post George Floyd, it was the buzz, like it was all
Yeah.
the buzz on
Yep.
college campuses across the 50 states, across in the world. Folks were talking about DEIA, right? And it really served as a catalyst to push these initiatives to the forefront, right? To start to
Yep.
mold institutional values, even if internally some people weren't
Hmm.
really, their values weren't changing. Externally, we had to start thinking about how DEIA would play a role in our institutions. And so recently, in November, after the new president was elected, he made an announcement. Some folks listening may have heard it, some may have not, where he essentially threatened colleges and universities across the 50 states,
Hmm.
saying that if the initiatives that we had adopted, the new value system, right? This idea that inclusivity was going to be a part of campus culture and the fabric in which we worked and these students went to school in, if it wasn't to be rolled back, right? Endowments to the colleges and universities would be withheld, and part of that would be awarded to quote unquote victims of DEIA.
Right.
Okay. And so I just want to broadly, and I know that, people can say whatever they want to say, right? The president can make sort of broad statements that he may not be able to follow up on, right? And so I want to give that credence as well, right? That he can
Mhm.
say whatever he wants, but it may not necessarily happen. But I also want to think about, because I am very proactive instead of reactive, I want to think about what the broader consequences of rolling back DEIA initiatives would be on college campuses
Right.
if it were to happen. What would that look like? I mean, are we looking at like a mass exodus of people of color, faculty, staff, students? Like, what is this going to look like realistically?
Yeah, I think it'll look different geographically
Mm-hmm.
and by institutional type for
Mm-hmm.
sure. But yeah, broadly, yeah, attrition will go up. It will be harder to retain students from backgrounds that we're not intentionally trying to impact. I think it's interesting because a lot of the rhetoric of the new administration is talking about like diversity, equity, inclusion, like as this like monolithic symbol of something that they think is like anti-meritocracy, right? But in essence, DEI is meritocracy. Like it's saying, hey, there's things that are not equal, that are not equitable, that are not even close to fair. And the funny part is the irony of it, right, is that like they see it as like this monolithic thing that's like an end result. And folks that are doing actual DEI work look at it as like a problematic framework that is trying to get us somewhere. Like it's not even close to getting us where it needs to get us to be uh, equitable and fair and sustainable. And so, yeah, this is rough, right? Because now we have this rollback of something that wasn't even having the impact that we desired in the first place, right? But it was something that was going to get us there. And you mentioned right after the murder of George Floyd, like as evidenced by the Google trends of like just everyday people doing
Mm-hmm.
Google searches on things like racism and privilege and white supremacy, like people had their eyes were open, right? And they were getting exposed to something that maybe they hadn't thought about before. I do prejudice reduction workshops, and I've been doing them for like 15 years, and it just amazes me that people way into adulthood have never had a conversation about who they are and how the world perceives them out in the open, right? They've kind of maybe internalized things or maybe had conversations with families sporadically, but they've never really had a conversation about like, who are you and how does the system view you? How do other people in your interpersonal relationships view you? And how does that impact you ultimately? You know what I mean? And so yeah, this is interesting. But to answer your question, I think yeah, attrition will rise, retention will be harder for people of color, particularly programs like Puente and Asian American and Pacific Islander initiatives are at risk. And we've seen back east, like some programs have just stopped. A very prominent institute out of Rutgers, I follow them in their DEI institute, and they were having this micro conference online, just like a webinar related to DEI, and they sent out a message last week that was like, basically, we've been told by our higher ups that we have to cancel this. You know what I mean? And so,
Mm-hmm.
if you had told me that 15 years ago, when I was in my grad program, and the founder of this institute was on a live conference with us in my class, talking about the work she was doing, I would have never guessed that she would have to send out a message like that.
Right. Wow, that's sad that it's already happening, right?
Uh-huh.
we we are not even fully into January, and
Right.
we're seeing it happen. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about. So one of the things that really stood out to me in the training that I took with you was the emphasis on data, right? It has been data tells us a story, right? It talks about what our students are going through in a very real way, both, with the combination of quantitative and qualitative data. And we have used it in order to be able to identify areas, the gaps, right? Identify the gaps and to be able to address those gaps. And so if, for folks out there who haven't read Project 2025, and it's specifically the chapter on the Department of Education, which I actually do an entire episode on it. So the very first episode that I do. So please, if you haven't listened to that one, make sure you go and check it out. The latter half of the chapter talks about DEIA. It talks about CRT, and it talks about civil rights, right? And it essentially invalidates the importance of disparate impact,
Hmm.
right? It's vitally important for us to understand disparate impact in order to understand the equity gaps. And
Right.
so if if the federal government is using these suggestions as a baseline for getting rid of DEIA, and they're not valuing the data that's being used for civil rights cases, or to be able
Hmm.
to fund specialty programs or whatever it is, um, my question is, this could very much lead to either two outcomes: institutions not recording the data on disparate impact at all, right? Because they no longer see the value in it. Or if they are recording that data, if they are collecting that data, ignoring it so that they can comply with anti DEIA initiatives, government initiatives. Um, and so I'm wondering if we can talk about some of the dangers of ignoring the data, right? Because the data is so telling.
Right. Right. Um, this is this question is a difficult one because and this could be like the pessimist in me, but I don't know that we were paying enough attention to the data to begin with. So I don't know
Fair.
how that I don't know how to track the fall off, right? Uh, but what I do know is I look at things of the pat the kind of entire movement for this current administration was built around this idea of like a past America.
Mm-hmm.
And I I look at something like redlining, for example, right? So like let's kind of shape these districts and say who can't have housing or whatnot or loans from banks and things like that, which is essentially like let's do this and then hide the data and say like this is just it is what it is. And to a certain extent, if we don't look at disparate impacts and data, then what we're really doing is setting ourselves back like decades because as an institution, you're looking at graduation rates. We can't figure this out. What's going on? Why is this happening? And already and the reason why I started this question with I'm kind of pessimistic regardless. Like I know many institutions that have made gains. Like when you look at like the U.S. World Rankings for colleges and universities and their progress toward DEI initiatives and graduation rates, a lot of those gains have been made with like admissions and enrollment kind of shady practices, right? Like they're
Mm-hmm.
like, oh well, let's just up the GPA requirement at this public institution, and oh wow, our graduation rates are kind of increasing, and so that's why I'm kind of like pessimistic about how we view how we previously, prior to this administration, even implemented DEI stuff. But yeah, that's gonna get worse. Like that's
Hmm.
gonna get infinitely worse. Because the data's gonna bear out, right?
Hmm.
That we're gonna have like a drag on graduation rates and retention rates, and then the only solution is gonna be, well, we need to recruit smarter, better students,
Hmm.
aka we need to like de-diversify institutions to get the metrics that we need. It's it's hard to know only a month in because it's the messaging and the policy is so messy.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because in one breath, you have I guess the cabinet member in Elon Musk saying, H-1B visas are a good thing, and we need the most educated, talented black and brown folks to come here and do stuff in software. And then that person at the same time saying, um, our education system is terrible and we need to defund education. It's like, well, if you if your whole pitch was to hire more Americans, but you're saying the H-1B visa pathway is a lot better, and because America is not intelligent, but
Hmm.
yet you also don't want to do anything to up our intelligence, like what's going on here? It's confusing,
Right.
and it's not clear, and so that's also very telling when it comes to erasure data, and I think it's very telling as well too. Like right, all through the campaign last year, like people are just in these interviews and in these town halls just saying, but that's not what the data says, and it's just this
Right.
erasure of like that doesn't matter.
So essentially, we'll go back to a time where we are blaming students for the inability to be able
Right.
to pass their classes or to graduate. Um,
Yeah, we'll amplify the amount we already do that. And the reason why I say amplify it because I'm at so many tables. It's like, oh hey, Georgetown is in their first year experience program. They're talking about agency rather than time management and study skills and stuff like that. And they're talking about agency with respect to like you're in an institution and a system, and how does that institution and system view you, and it wasn't created for you.
right.
And I'll get the, oh, but is that fair to all students if we focus on that? Or is it fair to all students if we have a black graduation? So that's already there. And that's now that just has way more credence than it ever did, right?
Hmm. The similar to the All Lives Matter.
Yep. That's exactly what it is.
um, okay. So the other thing that really stood out to me when I was reading Project 2025, there is this movement where they are trying to get rid of teaching critical race theory in all public institutions. I mean,
Hmm.
mainly right now the discussion is in K through 12. It's not appropriate to talk about racism with, a 12 or 13-year-old, which is insane because, you know, 12 and 13-year-olds are experiencing racism, right? Um, and so there's this backlash against critical race theory. And there's this movement to try to get it out of the classroom. Well, DEIA is defined really broadly, right? There's so many things that fall under DEIA, and the trainings that are, professional development or at conferences, or they're, being used to teach folks about DEIA, um, typically use CRT as the foundational theory to understanding how systems are inherently racist, right? And
Hmm.
specifically higher education. And
Right.
so if we are forced to remove CRT, or we can't talk about CRT um, from these trainings, how are we going to foster critical thinking about systemic oppression with faculty who don't understand systemic oppression, don't understand how it works, right?
Hmm.
Um, how is this going to affect professional development in general?
Yeah, I feel like we're in for a lot of faculty either intentionally or inadvertently gaslighting students into thinking that like, oh, if you're experiencing some form of oppression or racism, that's like a you
Probably.
thing. Like you need, you know, personal support for that because that there's we don't know what you're referring to. Those were just individual instances throughout your life that you need to address or things that you need to cope with, right? Because it's just basically saying that like, oh, there's no system out to get you. There's not a policy, um, in there. Essentially, like I'm thinking about Florida because they're like one of the more quote unquote progressive states in rolling back DEI stuff. And I'm thinking about like they're essentially what Florida's saying in education is that like slavery taught people good skills, like that it was something that happened in history, and as a result, people became very skillful, and that's the gist of what you need to know about slavery, right?
Uh-huh.
And I feel like that in and of itself is very damaging.
Hmm.
Um, uh, like the kind of term the phrase that history repeats itself unless you're being told about systemic oppression, you are not going to have any clue. Like the generations that are born during this election, or the young folks that are in junior high, or kind of prior to that high school phase where you do start to look at more nuanced versions of history. Yeah, it's going to be very damaging to that group of people, and which then makes it damaging to like the future House of Representatives, the future Senate, future
Hmm.
judges, future lawyers. Um, yeah, I'm when it comes to critical race theory, I learned about it as a philosophy major out of like people like John Stuart Mills and folks that just and Cornell West that talk about just systemically and legally how things have been positioned in society to benefit groups and devalue other groups. And it's interesting because CRT now is like this big umbrella term for like anything that has to do with slavery or black advancement or the advancement of women or anything like that. The the Tuskegee Airmen portion of the Air Force training video
Hmm.
being taken out as like a response to like, hey, we got to roll back DEI. So the Air Force was like, okay, well, let's not teach about the Tuskegee Airmen or the first women in aviation. Is like literally okay. So if we just look at that on the surface and we look at the logic of that, so who's left?
Hmm.
So who are you teaching about? Like what figures are you teaching? Because it's not like they said, "Oh, we're just going to teach about the mechanics of flight and the planes, and we're not going to talk about people at
The
all."
heroes. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not gonna heroize. We're not gonna uh, prop anybody up as heroes. No, they're saying like, oh, no, we're specifically not gonna talk about Tuskegee Airmen and the first women in aviation. Okay. So
So who are
that
we
that
talking
leaves
about?
white folks, and I think that's the most interesting part is like how long can this fallacy go on
Hmm.
of anti DEI? Like it just seems so illogical that I don't know how long it continues,
Hmm.
but with, a packed House and Senate, at least another 2 years. And then how long do
And
those
and
ripple
a
effects
and a
continue?
stacked Supreme Court, right? A stacked.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And yeah. Don't even get me started on no term limits.
Yeah. Um, Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's really scary to think about all of this because it really has, as a person of color, it's been really refreshing to see um, institutions adopt these
Hmm.
principles and to encourage folks to understand um, a very different perspective that they may have never been exposed to.
Right.
Right. Um, the idea that their reality isn't everybody's reality, right? That we may be living in separate Americas.
Uh-huh.
And so, yeah, it's super, super interesting to see how that's going to play out. Um, so when Donald Trump first made the announcement about reparations for DIA, the first thing that came to mind, and you mentioned these groups in an earlier response that you gave me, there is a lot of programming out there that is targeted for specific racial affinity groups, and not just
Hmm.
racial affinity groups. I mean, Umoja, Legacy, Puente, they're targeted for specific racial affinity groups, but we're also talking about programs that are federally funded, like EOPS. Right.
Yep.
I worked for that program. Guardian Scholars that supports foster youth.
Foster youth.
um,
Yep.
we have undocumented programs. I know those
Hmm.
aren't typically federally funded, but um, when when funds get tight, right? If we're not receiving federal funding in these areas, then maybe local or state funding gets filtered elsewhere, right? So it's a
Right.
domino effect. Um, so my biggest worry is for these groups that have really relied not just on the resources, not just on the financial aspect that these programs provide, but the community,
Right.
right? We
Hmm.
know that if students do not feel like they are welcome at these institutions, if they don't feel welcome in the academy, they'll leave,
Right.
right? If they don't feel like they
Hmm.
are part of something. And that's why these programs were created, to let them know you are in fact not alone, right? And there are other folks who understand you, who've been through a similar situation. We are here to help. We're here to support your very unique needs, right? If these programs are defunded because of DEI, anti-DEIA initiatives via executive orders or
Hmm.
dear colleague letters or whatever, right? Where will the community come from? Where will we be able to provide spaces where our students feel safe?
Right. Um, yeah, it's so interesting because the reason federal government was even in the mix to do this programming was because, you know, states were just not were not able to convince the voting populace to the value of, not able to fund, not able to provide resources toward. And so, like, it wasn't like EOP existed in this vacuum of, you know, we this is a program that we just thought of doing because it existed as a tradition of like, okay, states are not prepared for what we as a government see. And this was done by a very sign like Lyndon Baines Johnson was not uh, a progressive, liberal, equity minded person. He just happened to be the president that signed into effect some of these things that were like an obvious, what, we've always been a country of immigrants and we're too diverse to continue on this road. Um, and now for that work to be undone with a few strokes of a pen, is tragic. One. What happens is my sincerest hope is that this is a wake up call
Mhm.
for folks. and it does extend back to LBJ, right? And a lot of the fact that a lot of this stuff happened, like a lot of the sit-ins and bus boycotts and stuff like that, were kind of propagated by Black folks in the civil rights movement, but benefited everybody.
Hmm.
And so when I think about, um, folks like Stokely Carmichael, they didn't call it DEI. They didn't like it was a Black Power movement, it was a liberation movement, it was self-determination, it was civil rights. Um, my greatest hope is that this is a wake-up call for people to be like, you know what, we got to continue this at all costs, no matter what. You mentioned EOP&S, that program specifically, right? First generation students. That's that's the child of migrant farmers in California, but that's also the child of former coal miners in West Virginia.
Hmm.
That's white, right? And I've specifically seen tons of white students benefiting from EOP programming and services.
Hmm.
And I'm thinking about when that group who may have voted in this last election in favor of policy that was antithetical to what their actual lives were like, when they start to see it, and then we can properly organize and try to roll back what's being rolled back, which is like 20 steps backwards to get one step forward.
Hmm.
But that's best case scenario. It's going to be a long ride
Yeah.
for diversity, equity, inclusion for sure.
Yeah, EOPS saved me when I was in college. I had no idea what I was doing. I'm
Hmm.
first generation, grew up low socioeconomic, woman of color, right? My mom was a single Black mother, right? And so, um, when I went to college, I had no clue what I was doing. Didn't know how
Right,
to sign up for
right. Me
classes.
neither.
Didn't know how to get financial aid. I showed up
Hmm.
literally the day before classes started, and I remember this, my counselor, I'll never forget him. He sat me down and said, "Oh girl, what do you want to do?" And I started crying because I had no clue. And so many of our students, because I worked for EOPS for like 8 years almost, so many of our students were in that very same position, and I shudder to imagine
Right.
what would happen to
Yeah.
programs like that.
Yeah.
What would happen to students if programs like that did not exist to support
Hmm.
them? So,
School lunches.
yes, I mean, we haven't even talked about K-12. School lunches are
Yeah.
free school lunches. That's how our students are able to focus in their
Uh-huh.
classes.
Yep.
If you got a stomach, if your stomach's growling, you're not worried
Right.
about the math problem on the chalkboard,
Right.
right? Um,
And the tragic part is let's talk about sum total of who benefits from school lunches. We are still a majority white country
mhm,
at all levels of class, right? Like, yeah, we talk like DEI was meant to focus on like the disproportionate impacts, but there's also still an impact.
mhm,
And like we were not the like sum total people benefiting from a lot of this programming, right? And in fact, that was our indictment and our complaint about how these programs were being utilized and leveraged
mhm,
is that, hey, this is supposed to be about equity along like race, for example, but somehow white women seem to be the highest beneficiary, or this is supposed to be along like the
mhm,
disproportionate impacts of class, but somehow white folks seem to be the primary beneficiary. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see if people do wake up to that and what that looks like, and if we just
mhm,
go back to what we were doing in the first place.
mhm.
Um, but the math just doesn't math on
Right.
what what the purpose of these rollbacks are.
Right. So, the next thing I wanted to talk about is, so there's going to be a lot of administrators who do not agree with rolling back DIA policies, right? We have We've done a really good, I feel like we're doing a better job of hiring more
Hmm.
diverse folks in higher education. We're at least on that path. Um, but I also know that every institution that I have ever worked at, and I've worked at a few at this point, the number one thing that they value is money. They don't want to get sued. They don't want to put themselves in any
Right.
situation where they're going to have to face a legal liability, right? Because job security,
Right.
right? That,
Right.
the more money that, if we're paying out people who are suing, that means less resources for the students, less ability to pay the faculty and staff, right?
Right.
And so when an administrator is faced with having to take an action that is against their moral compass, right, in favor of compliance and making sure that they do not face any legal liabilities, how how is this going to play out? um because that's, in my eyes, like, that's how what I've questioned is, like, in a position where I have to choose between my morals and my values, or doing something
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
maintains the status quo and I can keep my job, right?
Right.
What are we going to be looking at as a populace?
It's the W.E.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass. Do you fight from within? Do you fight from outside? Yeah, that's a lot of folks are gonna have to come to that um, discussion. So I would say read read about those gentlemen and like what where they kind of the dialogue that they had around that.
Hmm.
Um, I what's interesting is I think that like as an administrator in California, for example, Proposition 209 is very interesting in the fact that it basically is kind of like a muzzle of sorts for affirmative action, for example. And so it says like, hey, you can't say that you have a program for black students or you can't just only kind of categorize and benefit one group based on a certain class. And what that did in California was just like change the strategy of, right? The strategy of is like, okay, so this is about we're highlighting a black cultural experience, and anybody who can benefit from that can, join, attend, be involved in, be a member of, be president of. And so I think a lot of that's going to happen. Just the renaming, reclassifying for the purpose of getting the funding. But also back to the previous question, what I hope happens as we now have this opposition that allows us to like reevaluate everything. We had to force states to serve groups at diners, right? We had to say there's no law that tells a business owner that like, oh, you have to, serve black folks.
Hmm.
It was like, hey, if you don't serve black folks, then that highway funding that your state gets, like, we're not providing that anymore.
Hmm.
So you make the choice of whether you want these shops to serve black folks or not, right? Like we had to like go around and do things like that. And so and that was at a time where, right, there wasn't as much bargaining power.
Hmm.
And so I hope that now we look at that as like, yes, that was progress, but that was also something that once it was passed, we kind of like just stood on our laurels about like, okay, well, we can eat now.
Hmm.
When we should have been like, no, every month we're going to put forward a, a, a law that we need to be like ingrained in our country that allows for that. And so I hope that our fight in terms of policy is a little bit different. But within the institution, Um, yeah, I hope that administrators do whatever they can to continue fighting within. It's hard to fight from the outside with very little power or influence. Yeah, and I've always been a proponent of like, and as a designer, right, like the main thing that you can do is work within constraints. This for me is just a set of constraints it's making me think like, okay, well, how can I go hyper local with my politics? Like, I think I, my number one criticism of myself post election, like as a voter, was, you know what? I'm a little bit too focused on my day to day life and work and research
Mm,
and not focused enough on like who the city council person is and what's going on locally and how I can change that to then change, what goes on, at a countrywide level. I think that's the criticism that I have for myself, and I think that's the criticism that I would have for my institution too, is like, how do we how do we address some of these issues as a county, as a state, as a university? How do we work from there? And while at the same time keeping the fight up at the national level.
well, and I want to even take that a step further for, for folks who are in the classroom or who are running these programs. Um, locally could just look like not changing the policies in your classroom, right?
Hmm.
taking it underground.
Like
um,
the grant proposal says one thing, and
right.
then
And I mean, I know we get, as faculty, we get reviewed. Depending on your institution, it could be like once every three
Mhm.
years. And so a lot of the practices that we have implemented into our classroom, they don't even necessarily specifically have an equity label on them, right?
Right.
Like, I just did a podcast episode on ungrading or grading for equity, right?
Uh-huh.
Now, there's different ways to call it, right? But alternative methods of grading are grounded in equity. And so
Yep.
I think it's really important for us to think about how we can continue to offer services in a way that creates inclusivity for our students, because I don't want my students running from my classroom. I
Right.
I want to make sure that students are coming, they're feeling welcome, they're feeling like they're part of the community within my
Uh-huh.
classroom, and that they're successfully passing, right?
Right.
In whatever way that I can make that happen. And so, for those who are listening and going, I don't know what I'm going to do, take it to the underground. That's what I say, right?
Yeah.
Do everything that you can as covertly as you can. And if somebody's making noise or claiming DEIA, and wanting to, telling you that that's a liability, at least that you haven't compromised your moral compass,
Right.
to
Right.
fit the status quo, or to conform to these new evolving standards.
There's so many. I think one thing that was very dark for me too was just how quickly, and we talked about this before, you and I, just how quickly like institutions and states were like, oh, okay, well, we're not supposed to do that anymore. Like, goodbye. And that tells me that, there's a significant amount of the country that never wanted to do it in the first place.
Yeah, very
But
performative.
like you said, it's one of those things where like the logic just bears out that if we want to improve graduation, if we want to improve society, if we want to improve education, like we have to address inequities.
We have to
And
adapt.
so, yeah, I hope that we continue doing that however we can. If the grant has to say the student success program for every student, sure, okay. What does that look like? Do we give $1 to every student, or do we give $1,000 to students who are in need of $1,000 based on where they're positioned, right?
Right. And I think, I want to implore, educators out there who don't necessarily agree with DEIA. I want to implore you to think about the fact that while we are a majority white country, that trend is on the outs, right?
Right.
Eventually,
Hmm.
eventually there
Yep.
are going to be more people of color than there are white folks. And so if your classroom is not adapting with the times,
Yep.
you're losing out on enrollment, right? Like that's your job on the line because
And then worker shortage, right?
right,
Like
right,
who's gonna build your bridges? Who's gonna take us to space? Yeah.
right,
Who's gonna be your doctor, your physician?
right. So
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much, William, for being a guest host on my episode. You offered up some really amazing insights, and I'm curious to see where all of this goes, right? Because we are so in the beginning stages of this administration and what their plans are. And so, hopefully, what my hope for this episode is that this can kind of spark the conversation in other areas of higher education where folks can go instead of waiting for the stuff to hit the fan, right? We can start
Right.
thinking about ways that we want to push against anti DEIA initiatives.
Right.
So, again, thank you so much. And for our audience members out there, thank you for joining us today for today's episode. We hope you enjoyed and you too received some insight on what the future of DEIA might look like in higher education. If you liked this episode, make sure that you subscribe to my YouTube channel, The Higher Ed Institute, and like this video so we show up on your algorithm again. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.